You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're recording this podcast for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there that we're putting all of these out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and this is our first one where I'm actually in your mother's hometown and Aunt Wanda's house in Rayford, North Carolina.
It's pretty wonderful to see you be able to move and be able to see some of these places on camera. I wish I could be there.
Mm-hmm.
You've been able to record a few times here in New York, and we've been able to record in Maryland. Maybe one day soon we'll be able to record in North Carolina.
Yeah, good.
But I'm happy you're here tonight.
Thank you.
Tonight we are reviewing Star Trek The Next Generation, Season 3, Episode 14, A Matter of Perspective, which debuted on February 12th, 1989.
Oh, one thing.
Oh, sorry.
I'm wrong about the dates. It's actually 1990.
Oh, is it 90? Oh, we're in the
Yes.
90s now.
Yes. Yeah. The last three episodes have actually been in the beginning part, January and into February of 1990. I made an error there.
Oh, well, I'll go back and make sure to correct those.
Mm-hmm.
But wow, actually, that leads me to a good question that we'll be asking about. But so February 12th, 1990. This is actually Margot's birthday too. Margot, my wife,
That's
Ben,
right.
your mama.
That's right.
The in-universe date is 43610.4 in the year 2366, and the crew of the Enterprise has arrived to Tanuga 4, and an away team has completed its survey of Dr. Nell Apgar's research and is ready to return to the ship. But before that, the actual scene opens to Captain Picard attending an art class with two other crew members in a section of the ship that I don't think we've ever actually seen before. But it's a very subtle opener where Data provides kind of a humorous start to the episode where he interprets a different art rendered by the crew members based off this nude model that they are looking at in the room. And of course, he blindly destroys Picard's sense of
he politely tells Picard that his painting sucks.
terribly,
Yes.
and it is actually pretty bad.
Yeah.
But I think once we get into like the heart of this episode, a lot of the humor goes away.
Mm-hmm.
So let me get back to where we are because the opening is a little wonky. So after completing a delivery of dicalcium to the Tanuga 4 research station, the away team has received an update from Dr. Nell Apgar that his efforts to create Krieger waves, a potentially new energy source, is near completion. As Picard enters the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Geordi LaForge beams back to the station, and the captain asks where Commander Riker is. Lieutenant LaForge replies that he's still in the station with Dr. Apgar and is working with Apgar because Apgar apparently wanted to speak to Riker. Although LaForge replies evenly, Picard notices that there is some tension in Geordi's reporting about the relationship between Riker and Apgar. Just as they are about to get underway, the space station that Commander Riker and Dr. Apgar are aboard explodes. In a dramatic sequence, Chief O'Brien is able to engage the transporters and bring Riker back at the very last moment. This, however, opens up an investigation where Riker is immediately, pretty quickly, accused of the murder of Dr. Nell Apgar. And we get into basically I don't know, this. How do you feel about this episode? Because on one hand, I have varying thoughts. Um, I think it's the weakest episode so far of season 3. In the
It's
fact that I think a lot of the things that help set it up are very weakly put together, and then the actual execution of it isn't very good. But tell me what you think. I would
I
like to hear what your thoughts.
I looked at this episode as sort of a Star Trek murder mystery.
Right,
I think it's interesting we'll describe this more, but they would use holodeck technology to recreate
right,
different versions of what Riker reported from the perspective of uh, Dr. Abkar's wife, from Dr. Abkar's assistant. So that was interesting, and then how they figured that out, and it also made me think that it kind of demonstrated there wasn't a jury in this trial, but
right,
it sort of demonstrated how juries are challenged with looking at different facts and so on. And it's interesting that we bring this up. Maybe I thought about this because something we were talking about before the podcast started was there was a trial in Wisconsin about a young man named Kyle Rittenhouse who was sort of like a vigilante. He was from Illinois. Last summer or
well,
whatever
he
it
is a
was,
vigilante.
2 years ago, he went to
Yeah,
a protest in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is right over the Illinois border into Wisconsin. He had an AR-15, and he got in an altercation with some more left-wing protesters that, from my understanding, they had sidearms also, and there was an altercation.
one of them had a weapon.
Right. So three men were shot, two were killed, and one was seriously injured. And not to discuss the outcome, but what happened is that they basically acquitted him of murder charges because the case was made that he was threatened and it got into some self defense
Right.
laws and so forth. And then the other counterpart, just today, there was a trial that ended up in southern Georgia where three white men had chased down an African American black man and said that they were making a citizen's arrest because they suspected him of uh, uh, burglary, and there was really no evidence. But anyway, the jury, which was 11 white people, one African American, found them all guilty of
Yeah.
various felony charges. So it's just interesting to think about, this model of how they were able to use holodeck technology to recreate scenes to
Hmm.
look at, well, what really happened here from different perspectives. And I think it was interesting because when prosecutors and defense attorneys put witnesses
Hmm.
on the stand, it's sort of like, well, these are the things that juries have to sift through when they're, on any case, but it's very challenging, particularly when you have a high profile, difficult case like these two.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up a really important point about the versatility of a future technology like the holodeck and being able to arbitrate these proceedings.
Mhm.
Because, on one hand, I think you highlight a very distinct weakness in our trial system as it is today. You know, you have to put someone up on the stand and you have to take their word for evidence. You have to take their view of how they tell the story, something that you can't see or experience for yourself, and you have to take it all on the base of their verbal reporting of it. And there's only so much that someone can communicate with their words, even emotionally. Like, there was a lot of um hay made of Kyle Rittenhouse crying on the stand during the trial. And on one hand, it's like, yes, he is conveying this kind of pain that he suffered, but on the other hand, there's a lot baked in culturally into that crying that is hard to really parse out in a courtroom, but for people on the outside, it becomes a very different thing. Um, I think what you're saying with the holodeck technology is that this really does cut out a lot of that. I think that cognitive bias of just hearing a person and what they're saying and being able to actually see people move and interact. Like, I think it would be very different if people saw Kyle Rittenhouse firsthand have to either defend himself or murder, according to his accusers, those two men and the third person he wounded in Kenosha. I think it would be a very different conversation if we had to see that play out in real time and then make the judgment there in the courtroom with it.
Hmm.
I think you're absolutely right. I do have to say on the other hand though, I kept thinking that there was an inherent danger in this. Um, the one thing about our court system right now that may be a positive, and there's many cases where it's a negative too, but you actually have to bring physical evidence to court. Never once in this actual Never once in this actual episode was any real physical evidence presented of anything. Like,
Well, right.
I
Well,
mean, they had scans. They had scans of things, and you can count that. But like, in terms of in the real world, having a material thing is able to provide. It's able to provide you a foundation of support to your argument that, like, I'm not sure a holodeck would be able to completely facsimilate, if I'm saying this
well,
correctly.
the only way they had any physical evidence, it was indirect because
Right.
what happened.
Exactly.
What happened was that they noticed that there were these powerful radiation events of an unknown type that started to show up on the Enterprise, and maybe to jump ahead a little bit, but what was figured out
Absolutely.
that Professor Abkar had actually was successful in creating these Krieger waves, and the Krieger waves were what was causing this radiation burst. And
Hmm.
once Geordi sort of figured that out, and I think Wesley Crusher again had something to do with that, as he always
Hmm.
does, um, that was what the final holodeck version that was presented to Chief Inspector Cragg from Tanaka 4 to show how the station really was destroyed. And before you say anything else, I have a question that I just thought about. If the station, if when Riker was on the station and Apgar's assistant and his wife were there, how did they get off the station before it blew up?
So
Was that ever? I'm
yeah, they confirmed twice during the episode that, like, Manoa and I always forget the assistant's name for some reason. Um,
Yeah, I didn't
I
note
give
her name. I didn't note her name.
Tana, Tana.
Tana, that's right.
Um,
Yes, 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 right.
Yeah, they established that Manu and Tana beam down before Riker and Apgar have their
I
final
see. Okay,
interaction.
right.
Well, I think one other problem that you see with the holodeck itself is that it really is, well, first of all, I think I think the problem with the premise of this episode is that it's not an actual court case.
Hmm.
Like, this is like you noted that this is a murder mystery, but the way it's treated is through an actual investigation and proceedings, and almost like it's almost a court case. Um, the difference is that they are dealing with with a society, and I think you put it very well in your notes. Tango before they have a system, I think, based on the assumption of guilt.
It's like the old Napoleonic law system that you're considered guilty and you have to be proven innocent.
Right. Which I think is kind of an interesting premise because on one hand, when you use the holodeck, you're a lot of what we a lot of what you see happen in court, I think, is lawyers trying to build narratives and counter narratives to each other.
Yes.
And one thing that I thought that the holodeck failed to do in this episode was find a way to keep all of the narratives coherent. There, at one
Hmm.
point when they do, when Geordi and Wesley help Picard put together all of the evidence to show how Dr. Apgar had kind of conspired to kill Will Riker, and invariably it ended up blowing up his own space station laboratory. Um, there was a lot of jumping around in terms of time instances, and I actually found that part of the story a little bit jarring compared to the rest of the episode.
Hmm.
And I just kept thinking, like, do you know what? If I was in a courtroom and I was watching this happen, I would literally stop right there and say, wait a second, you're just telling us your story. You can manipulate this however you want, and
Right.
you're introducing us to this technology that we have no idea about. And somehow we're just taking this all on faith.
Well,
I think that the danger of a holodeck is that I think it would be easy to tamper with, honestly, in terms of how material evidence is presented.
well, a couple things. As you said in the beginning, I think you're right. Is that there is not a great deal of cohesiveness in the episode because when you have these different versions of events presented as a holodeck image, you kind of had to jump around and say, well, it's like you had to work to fit the pieces of the puzzle together. And then when Tana's version was shown, I mean, it was
Right.
very clear. Picard pointed out, well, this is total uh, hearsay.
Well, the so one thing that I think is so difficult about this episode in 2021 is that, in 1990, and I wanted to ask you about this because in 1990 we didn't have like Law and Order Special Victims Unit, which is a show that deals with a police unit and a prosecution team dealing with sexual assault cases. We didn't have that show yet. We didn't have Me Too or the Time's Up movement yet. And today there is a huge question about how rape and sexual assault is handled in our legal system and the type of representation women get. And I think that this episode is a particularly hard one because it doesn't handle any of what happens, I think, in a very qualitative way. And I think there's a few reasons for that. I think the first one is that they only have 45 minutes. You
Mhm.
can't get into the nitty gritty of what is essentially a very dark, dark episode.
And this is a point that's come up recently when we talked about episodes. Is that as a writer, as a director,
Right.
you really have limitations and a struggle to get the story in enough detail in a 45-minute show. Exactly.
Ab- Absolutely. Well, like, I think if this episode, the way I looked at this episode is as a failure is the fact that this should be a two-parter. Like, if you're gonna tell this story, tell it over 90 minutes. Make it a two-part episode where, like, you show Riker, you know, show evidence of, like, you're not sure that Will Riker's innocent, and then in the second episode, show us why he's innocent. Because there's some central questions that never get answered in this episode. The first, the one that they're dealing with is whether or not William Riker murdered Dr. Apgar. But that's not the primary question. One of the primary questions that comes into this is whether or not Riker raped Manua or attempted to rape Manua. And it's such a central question that it's brought up, and there's such seriousness and weight put to it that by the time the episode ends, we still haven't dealt with it. Like it's almost left out in terms of whether or not this is something that happened. And I really want to bring some attention to this because structurally, I think the reason why this is so bad is because not only is the time constraints, but there's also certain things around the episode and what we've already seen in the show that could have answered these questions for us. For example, um, so Riker's version of events
Can I say something
paints,
real quick?
yeah,
You bring up a very good point because there's that they're really potentially charging Riker with two crimes. One is murder of Dr. Agpar.
yes,
Second is a sexual assault on his wife.
yes,
And the first charge is answered. I mean, that's
yes.
demonstrated, through the indirect evidence, direct slash indirect evidence that Geordi provides that, oh, well, there really were Krieger waves, and here he reflected, his energy off the beamer, the Riker's beam pattern, and that's what blew up the station. But you're right. The whole thing of did Riker, um, what I think would probably happen, knowing Will Riker, he did not try to assault
Well,
Manoa.
I
But
definitely wanted to get there.
the question is, what did Manoa do? Did she make advances on Riker? So
Well,
that whole issue is, as you said, is never resolved.
well, and here's why it's so problematic, and I hate using that word problematic. Here's why it's a problem that it's never resolved. You have two things in there that could resolve it for you. The first, so going through the actual case when it deals with this central issue of Manuel's possible sexual assault, the first one is like Will Riker presents this version that Manua is openly amorous and flirtatious and tries to seduce him before she's caught by Dr. Apgar. And it's painted as Will Riker is trying to constantly keep this woman off of him. You know, she's kind of like the classical Jezebel character. You can't really trust her, and you shouldn't really trust her with anyone that she's loyal to. Um, that is a that is a too typical storyline in itself. That I don't think lends well to this episode. Now, on the other hand, you have Manoa, who's painting the story that she is this loyal wife to Dr. Apgar, who is, more concerned about her husband's well-being than she is him pursuing his successful research that he promises is going to yield her riches and treasure to make up for all these years that he's been dragging her around the galaxy. And she paints the story of like this lecherous kind of aggressive, and at one point after her husband catches them and beats Will Riker up, cowardly William Riker that kind of doesn't fit the character that the viewers know. And
Mhm.
at one point, and this is the problem with this entire thing. At one point, Riker says, like, she's lying, she's not telling the truth. And he looks at Deanna Troy. Deanna Troy is an empath. And multiple times through this show, in the first and throughout the 3 seasons so far, she has been able multiple times to say, I can tell when people are lying and when people aren't.
Mhm.
And she kind of brushes this off like, of course, I know you. I know you wouldn't do this. But she believes you did. And it's one of those things where it's like, okay, that makes sense from the perspective that people believe the truth as they see it. But then you have Tana's testimony. And Tana's testimony is, um, in many ways, I think, damning of Apgar and damning of Manua, because what it essentially shows is that, like, Apgar kind of caught Riker and Manua in the middle of a awkward situation where no one really knows what happens, but it's very clear that Riker probably wasn't being aggressive with Manua. Um, it's kind of clear that Tana doesn't necessarily like Manoa either. Um, and ultimately, like, it's just kind of left with this idea that, like, no one's necessarily telling the truth, but no one's necessarily lying. So, by the time you get to the revelation that Apgar tried to murder William Riker and accidentally blew up his own lab, we just brush this entire thing off and just go on. Like, you even have the finale of the episode where everyone's sitting on the bridge smiling, saying, like, well, aren't we glad this is over? Let's get let's get on our way.
Well, and there's another point there is that once they figured out that Dr. Agpar had created the Krieger waves, and
Yes.
then they figure out that he was lying, that said, he was lying because he said, I need a couple more months to finish the work. And then they find that
Right.
he was successful, his experiments were successful. Then it's sort of a supposition, if not assumption, that what he was doing was he wanted to not give the technology to the Federation because he wanted to sell it to some other parties. And, since Abkar's dead, again, what physical evidence is there of that? I mean, that's a total assumption of what his motive was.
The the problem with the entire Krieger wave technology is that it's never really discussed what the actual end purpose of it is for. Is
Hmm.
it supposed to be turned into a weapon? Because that's kind of what it's painted as soon as it's discovered what is bombarding the Enterprise and destroying parts of like the deuterium
Yeah,
bulkheads.
right.
But they never like. Is it meant to power warp engines? Is it here to make weapons? Like,
Well, you're
what
right.
exactly does this?
I mean, they initially say that his purpose is to create a new energy source. But then when it starts boring holes in the various parts of the enterprise, I mean, yeah, that's where you kind of realize, well, if this is not controlled well, it could be used as a weapon then.
Right. And I think the larger, you know, one thing that we see the Federation do, and this kind of gets back to like the Mano and Tana situation. What we often see the Federation end up doing is that they're entering these independent contracts with researchers
I was just going to say that, right?
and offering no sort of monitoring or it seems like Dr. Apgar was out there alone building this Krieger machine. I'm just going to call it a Krieger machine. Building this Krieger machine, and suddenly the Enterprise shows up to like just receive an update and make a delivery to him. And his entire panic was kind of startling to me because, if you've been hired by one of the biggest intergalactic powers in the Alpha Quadrant, wouldn't you, as a professional scientist, expect to be monitored? Wouldn't you expect to have to report your progress even after, even if things are going long? It,
Absolutely. Yes.
it just seems to me like you have this kind of independent researcher out there on his own space station, no less, kind of doing whatever he wants. Like, none of this episode necessarily makes sense from an actual structural perspective. Um, One thing that I will say that is positive about it. Um, so I'm a big fan of Akira Kurosawa and his movie Rashomon, which is the story of a very similar, actually very similar to this story. A woman and her husband are accosted on the road by a vagabond, and the vagabond, according to the woman, um, rapes her and murders her samurai husband. What takes place is what we kind of see in this episode, a hearing to discuss the events and determine the truth, including a visitation. And this is where I think like the episode fails and why Rashomon is a success. In the story of Rashomon, Kurosawa has this kind of character who's this medium, a spiritual medium, come to Roshamon Gate and basically transfer the spirit of the husband and relate what the spirit of the husband actually saw, and relates that, the wife was traitorous to begin with and set the vagabond between him and her, um, and actually kind of manipulated the events. I may be getting this wrong, because it's been a long, long time. Let me just make sure I'm getting this ending right. I want to make sure I'm getting the. Oh, right. Okay. So in the story of Roshamon, the samurai's wife is assaulted by the vagabond, but for some reason, as crazy post World War II Japanese stories tend to do, she falls in love with her rapist and tries to convince her rapist to murder her husband so she can run off with him. And the samurai basically points. The samurai basically denotes how, like, I was killed by them and then he killed. We don't have that in this
Mhm.
episode.
No,
We don't
no.
have a medium character who can actually come forward and be like, okay, this is what really happened. And I think because we don't have that sort of character in this perspective, you know, Geordi and Data and Wesley are the ones that solve the murder mystery, but we never really solve the accusation. And
Hmm.
because we never really get a clear understanding of that, like I don't know. I know we keep going on about this, but I think this episode just it really kind of falls apart.
I think it's an interesting episode just because it makes you, like I said, I think it's a puzzle that to make any sense of it, you
Right.
have to, use some mental energy and keep track of things uh, to put the pieces together so it makes sense. But it's a sort of an interesting, intriguing story. But I agree. Now that we've talked about it and dissected it, it's really not put together all that well.
Well, one thing that and we may be ending this episode a little bit early.
Right.
Um, One thing that this kind of storytelling, the thing that bothers me about this kind of storytelling is that I think it is very much reflective of Western modern storytelling post 1990. I think one of the weaknesses that we have in storytelling in general is that we always have these ancillary characters that take part in episodes around the main character's actions and everything. And the main characters come into these ancillary characters' lives and have these huge impacts that, we see take place in the confines of an episode or a story or whatever have you. But after that ancillary character leaves, we don't see the actual impact of the events they took part in.
Hmm.
What happens to Manuel after this? What
Hmm.
happens to Tana? What happens to the Federation's relationship with Tango of Four? You know, I think one of the reasons I said I think this benefit if it was remade would benefit from being 90 minutes instead of 45 is because none of these characters are really fleshed out.
Mm,
And
true.
I think the fleshing out of characters in today's storytelling modes, where you see more seasons that are 13 episodes or 20 something episodes long, but follow only one story arc versus the episodic format you see in TNG. Um, I think the reason you see that now is because you saw in the 90s the weaknesses of stories like A Matter of Perspective, where, it has the bones of something really important to talk about, but it doesn't ever follow through because it doesn't have enough time or the thought or follow through to do so.
Well, here's a comment on that. If you look at how, I guess streaming and with
Yes,
uh,
I think I know where
you
you're
know,
going.
Amazon making its own production and Netflix making their own production and Disney Plus and so on and so
Paramount
forth,
Plus and
Paramount
yeah,
Plus. I mean, just thinking, watching. I mean, Mom's been watching Yellowstone, the new season of
Right.
Yellowstone. She's looked at previous seasons, and you know, these shows are at least an hour long. And then I
Hmm.
think of over the summer we both watched Outlander together, all the seasons caught up, and
Right.
all of those episodes were at least an hour, if not a little bit longer, perhaps. So there was enough time and enough seriality for each season that you could really flesh the characters out.
Commercials really do a number on
Yes.
classical TV. If you really go back and, especially Star Trek Next Generation, I have to say, if there really is a weakness to these shows and it's an inherent weakness they can't get around, you see where the commercials really do
Breaks.
break up
Yes,
the narrative,
they do. Absolutely.
and they get somewhat better in later seasons, but like
Right.
even still in season 3, it's still very jarring.
Yes.
Sorry,
Yes.
I'm sorry. Go on. I
No,
didn't mean to
that's a
interrupt.
that's a good point. I didn't, hadn't really thought of that before, but yeah, I mean, back when I mean, you even have this now on shows that are on, hour-long shows like Blue Bloods or FBI and so forth.
Hmm.
They have to write those scripts to allow for the commercial breaks, and it does
Oh,
break it.
absolutely.
It does break the narrative up.
Well, it's so a lot of writers are taught like the three-act structure. The beginning,
Hmm.
middle, and end. There's a
Hmm.
climax here. There's one or two events before that climax that kind of, and you may have a twist somewhere in there.
Hmm.
Um, Star Trek works usually on a 5 to 6 act premise.
Mm.
And that's because they used to actually have like 3 or 4 commercials at least. I remember in syndication, and I used to watch this a lot at Aunt Francis's in the guest bedroom on the TV at 2 in the morning.
Mm.
Um, they used to have like 5 or 6 commercial breaks during an hour, but they would also like block 3 or 4 Star Trek episodes together.
Hmm.
So on one hand, I think that there was an expectation that people were going to sit through these commercials to watch Star Trek anyway.
Hmm.
But now that we're in 2021 and we don't have that expectation, I think the I think the way we tell stories has changed so dramatically in terms of the pacing and timing
Hmm.
that we still don't have a realistic understanding of it. For example, and you've probably heard this one. One of the things that's been charged against millennials, which is my generation, and Gen Z, which is the generation that comes after us,
Hmm.
um, is that we have shortened attention spans. That's just not true.
I don't think that's true. Yeah.
Well, like you just mentioned that you and Mom sat through 5 seasons of Outlander and caught up with everything. You need to put aside time and energy to like actually sit there and catch up with like 5 seasons of a show. You
Sure.
actually need to have focus. I don't think that we are less focused or more attention deficit than previous generations. I think the difference is we are demanding of more engrossing stories,
Mm.
and I think that's really where the problem with this episode lies. From a 1990s perspective, I think that you could get away with the holodeck and you can get away with the mystery and you can kind of get away with the shoddy ending. But in 2021, the story isn't very engrossing.
Mm-mm. Right. I see the
And I
point. Yeah.
think I think because it's done on such a surface level,
Hmm.
that's why it hasn't held up, at least in my
Hmm.
opinion.
Hmm.
Um,
I think that's
Dad, thank
true.
you so much for joining me tonight. Do you have
Sure.
any comments that you would like to make about matters of perspective before we go?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well.
Okay. I think that this was a tough episode, but I think the next one is really great, and I can't wait for us to review Star Trek Season 3, Episode 15, Yesterday's Enterprise.
Hmm.
I'll see you then when we go over that episode, and we'll see you all again soon.
Okay. Good night, Jay.
Night.